So you're all very welcome to our recording of the climate action training this morning, getting people on board for festivals and production companies. I hope you're all very well this morning and looking forward to hearing more about engaging with your stakeholders and teams. On the webinar this morning is our team. My name is Megan Best. I'm from Native Events. We founded Native Events in 2017 to bring environmental action to the events, festivals, and cultural and creative sector. Also joining me is the fabulous Katrina Fallon of the Green Arts Initiative in Ireland. And Brecon Byron is here in the background, really captaining the ship and making sure that our Zoom webinar runs smoothly. So just to give you a bit of a run through, previously we ran a summer series of training webinars throughout June and July of this year. And it was very similar, but it was a slight tweak in that they were targeted at those strategically funded organisations and art centres. We did a session on nature and biodiversity in early July. We did a session on understanding and measuring impacts. And we've done a bit on buildings energy, so getting our teeth into that, and materials and procurement. Now we're in an autumn series and we're kind of tweaking this and focusing this more towards festivals and production companies. The reason being that during the summer, we thought that a lot of festivals might not be available to attend. And again, all of the recordings and materials of the previous series and this series that we're running now will be available on the Climate Action webpage of the Arts Council. So today we're looking at getting people on board for festivals and production companies, which is basically the middle part of a three-part mini series within this series, I guess, all about developing those policies and action plans, because there is quite a lot into just getting started and understanding how to start developing out those key documents. So what are the aims of this session? Well, we'd like you to go away from this session with a better sense of how to engage the stakeholders, both in your internal team who work really closely with you and those wider network of suppliers, artists, performers that you work with, venue managers and so on, and your wider influence on your audiences. So a sense of some nice ideas about how to really engage them when you're developing your climate action and environmental policy. Because if we engage from the beginning, we'll get better buy-in and hopefully get better success throughout. So today we're going to do a little bit of a recap on the earlier session on creating your climate and environmental policy. So we'll be tipping back into that a little bit. We'll be looking at getting people on board, the importance of involving people and all of those different people and stakeholders in developing your approach, because the impact on them and you is going to be that kind of cross-sectional thing. There are different approaches to engagement with different stakeholders, so we'll have a look at that. We'll look at identifying and mapping your key people in terms of your environmental and climate action policy. And I've got some nice examples of team engagement, and then finally, some do's and don'ts. So that's kind of what we're going to cover today. And now I'm going to hand over to Katrina to take us forward in terms of the next part of this morning's webinar. But while I do, and stop sharing my screen somehow, we are going to launch a quick poll for you all, just to understand who is in the room today. Katrina, over to you.
Now I'm doing my best to make that work, hopefully. So good morning to everybody, and lovely to be here with you. So yes, we've got just as a way of, I suppose, finding out a little bit more about where you're all coming from, a quick Zoom poll just to try and work out what kind of festivals or production companies that you might be involved in. There's a fairly good range there. From some of you may be coming from multidisciplinary festivals, some may be coming from festivals where you use a lot of venues, you don't do very much outdoor events, and others do a lot of outdoor events. So that's just going to get a sense across the board of the different kinds of festivals and production companies that are attending this morning. Because obviously, depending on what you're doing, your needs and your the stakeholders that you engage with are going to be very different.
Looks like we have a good broad range of diverse different types of
festivals. Does indeed.
Great.
Yeah. Okay, so one of the things we do, I suppose, with each of these sessions is just a quick recap on what happened in the previous session, because I suppose this particular webinar this morning and one that you would have attended last week if you were at it, or you can access that online. They both are really tied very closely together. They're really the kind of two steps of creating your environmental policy. So we looked at, we're going to do a quick recap on the previous session, which covered, introduction to environmental policies, the context for creating those policies, so national and sectoral, national around the climate ambition of the state, sectoral in terms of the Arts Council's own climate action plan, which we hope to see shortly, key steps in developing an environmental policy, policy do's and don'ts, mapping impacts from your activities, which is a really key part, because if you understand your activities, which of course you do as organizations, you're then better in a position to map what the impacts might be. And we gave some examples, and there were some worksheets to help on the way. So what should you cover in your policy? Well, basically, you're going to have an introduction, which outlines your organization and why climate and environmental action matters to you. What are your key environmental aims or commitments? What are your key priorities? Given who you are and what you do, maybe the principles underpinning your approach, who is accountable and responsible, and reference to plans for putting that policy into practice. Because obviously a policy in and of itself is a sort of statement of intent, but if you don't have the steps and the implementation and the who and who's responsible, you're not really going to be able to, that policy is not going to be as meaningful. So very quickly, if you looked at that in steps, this is, I suppose, the way we broke it down to help you create that environmental policy. And it really should be no more than 2 pages. So you're going to cover who you are, what you do, where you do, your mission or purpose, who you do it with and for, why climate and environmental action matters, what is your motivation, your overarching objective is this particular thing that you want to achieve as part of that policy, what your key areas of impact and influence are. And we really distinguish between those two. There are things that you can control and there are other things that you can influence. And it's important to know the difference between the two. What are your key commitments, objectives, targets, and so on? And they will be informed by the impacts that you have identified. So it's a kind of a step-by-step process, which takes away some of the overwhelm from the idea of having to create a policy. What are your priorities? What areas are you going to focus on? That will depend on a whole range of things, what kind of a budget you have, what kind of capacity you have within your staff team, and so on. Who else will you involve? And I suppose that's going to be the key focus for today. Who are the people who will be involved in creating and implementing your policy? And finally, who is accountable for that policy? When will it be reviewed? How will it be shared? So really what we're focusing on today is that step 7. Who else will you involve? So who are the people who will be involved in creating and implementing your policy, and why is it so important to collaborate with them? Because of course, there's really nothing stop you creating an environmental policy without consulting with those that you work and collaborate with. So any of us can, I suppose, go online, find either a template or maybe the example of a policy that another arts organization has used, in a matter of a few hours, just adapt it to suit your own purposes. And you then have a policy that I suppose ticks a box, but is it really going to achieve anything? So you'll never get the same level of engagement or buy-in from your colleagues and other stakeholders if you don't consult with them. And I think sometimes people find that quite daunting because it's a big exercise to have to do at the beginning. But if you don't do it, what you'll find is as you try and implement a policy and an action plan, and as you try and get things to happen and people to really get involved in what you're doing, you'll tend to hit road bumps along the way because the people that you're working with and for won't feel as engaged, and the whole thing has a tendency to kind of shudder to a halt. So we really would recommend that's I suppose why we've devoted a whole session to this particular topic, because we feel it's so important to engage with the people that you're working with and for. And that is across the board. So it's not just in arts organizations. If you think about the way the state and the SEAI and so many other local authorities, the more they engage with people on the ground, the more successful their policies and action plans will be, and the more relevant. But there are a few challenges. We would have done a session like this for venues and theatres, resource organizations, galleries earlier in the year. But there are unique challenges which really face festival organizers and production companies. And one of those is that for many festivals and production companies, you have a small core team working throughout the year. And that's complemented by additional colleagues and volunteers near to the time of the festival or production launch. That's, I suppose, particularly relevant for a festival where you could have, a small team of, less than 10 people, sometimes maybe only 4 or 5 people. And the nearer you get to the actual festival itself, suddenly that team of people really starts to ramp up. And of course, that creates challenges. If you're trying to embed a whole approach to sustainability and climate action into your organization, and you want to involve people, well, if they're not with you for the whole year, how are you going to do that in a meaningful way? You don't just want to have the 4 or 5 core people, and then how are you going to involve your volunteers and your caterers and all of the people that are involved in delivering your festival or your production. And the other thing is there's inevitably is a higher turnover of freelance staff for both festivals and production companies. And again, that's the whole project nature of what you're doing. So you might have a box office manager for your festival who's absolutely wonderful, and you go and try and recruit them again the following year, only to find that box office manager has moved on. Or you might have a wonderful tour manager for your production, and you go to recruit them for a particular tour and find that they've already started working with another production company. So that is definitely, those are challenges that venues and theatres don't face in the same way. So it's good to alert you to that, because that just adds another layer of complexity or challenge to trying to involve people from the very beginning. And finally, I'd say just in terms of, one other maybe challenge in connection with engaging with stakeholders is even your contractors, your suppliers, that whole area around procurement, that can also be an issue, because again, you might be contracting for services, could be catering services, could be waste collection. You're not entirely sure that you're always going to be working with the same contractor year in, year out. It could be that you have to tender, or you have to ask people to tender for those services if you're a big festival. So you may not have the same degree of control that each year you have to organize a tender process for that part of your festival, or less so for production companies. So considering how you might involve those people, and how can you make it meaningful for them, because they're the people that are going to be in the thick of it when your festival or your production is on tour. And is there a way of involving them and consulting with them at an early stage? And I think it's certainly valuable to bring those people in if you can. There's a cost involved in that, because you might be bringing them in at a time, maybe your festival runs in the summer, and maybe in November you'd invite all those stakeholders in. And if they're freelance, well, then you're going to have to pay them for the time that they commit. So, there are complexities around that. And I think later in the presentation, we'll talk about how you might go about engaging with those stakeholders. What can you do? What kind of an event or activity could you organize to draw them in? So I think we've got another Zoom poll now that Brecon is going to launch. Just looking at, in terms of that challenge for you as organizations, how many of your staff work throughout the whole year, or how many, is it a case that you've got, the bulk of them, that 75, 80% of your staff are there with you all year round? Or is it the case that you bring on, 50% or half of them, and so on? So if you could give us a sense of where you fit into that whole picture, because again, it just highlights the complexity of engaging with stakeholders for festivals and production companies. And I think I'm going to hand over to Megan now while you finish answering that. I think Megan is going to look at just some of the benefits of engaging with your stakeholders in a more sort of structured way, and also how you might map those stakeholders. So to you, Megan.
Thanks very much, Katrina. Yeah. I will just start sharing my screen now, but it's interesting to see the results of the poll coming through. Again, quite varied, but as you've quite rightly pointed out, a lot of the festivals do only have a core team for the year, and then are bringing on those extra staff and suppliers and freelancers on that kind of very much project by project basis. Okay. So I'm going to start chatting now about the benefits of stakeholder engagement and that collaborative approach that we want to take. And I suppose the very first piece of this is The collaborative piece is where we build trust in each other. And you guys are more than likely very, very aware of this. A festival environment and creating a festival is an exercise in collaboration and building trust with various teams and team members. So I don't need to go tell you too much about that, but this is definitely one of the benefits. Getting that buy-in from the very beginning and that sense of ownership from the team so that everybody feels that they've had input, that they know that this is something that they can actually action because they have been part of that co-design process is really important. It also gives your policy and your action plan credibility. So that trust and buy-in and credibility is something that you can rely on then because it becomes something that is deliverable as a team. So that buy-in and that sense of ownership that the whole team has and has a part of it. What's also really nice about this kind of stakeholder engagement piece is that everybody starts to be aligned. So everybody understands what it is that the goals and objectives are and what their role is in achieving those and aligning towards what the aspirations and aims of your climate and environmental action policy are. That also ensures that there's a consistency of approach. This is a really key one if we're looking at data gathering, for example, or impact measurement as part of our environmental policy. At least if there's a consistent way and a coordinated way of doing that, it becomes less cumbersome on the individuals and something that the team can share as a whole. More collaboration ultimately leads to those really good results, better results for everybody, better buy-in, better trust, and a much better policy and implementation across the board. So change really doesn't happen without people. It is the people who need to be a part of this and engaging with this. So when we're starting out with our engagement, with our climate action policy and thinking about writing it down, as Katrina quite rightly pointed out, we could just sit in front of a computer and write out a policy, but let's start thinking about who we need to get on board and how to involve them in change in the longer term. What we want to do is start to identify and map all of those different stakeholders and suppliers and teams and wider network to understand who we want to get on board and at what stage in the process. So how is this policy and the development of this policy going to impact on different members of the team? So when Katrina mentioned procurement there, if we're starting to think about procurement, let's take an example of catering. Who do we need to get on board when we're thinking about catering procurement? When we're thinking about feeding our teams, feeding our audiences, and feeding our artists, what are the questions we need to ask and who needs to be involved in that kind of decision-making process? I want to revisit this. This is a slide that I use quite a lot. We had it in the webinar last week, and this really is that kind of spheres of influence space. So right at the very center is what you control, your policy and your plan and your core team. Your core team are those decision makers. So when we're thinking about that procurement piece, when we're thinking about bringing in our suppliers and making decisions that are based, often very constrained by budget, we may as well call a spade, but we do have a core team who are decision makers and who need to have a good understanding of the goals and be aligned in our climate action and environmental action policies and plans, because they are the decision makers. And what they decide will have influence on that wider sphere of our suppliers, our artists, our stakeholders, our venue managers, and all of those different conversations that need to happen around our festival or our production with that wider network. We also have influence on an even wider sphere of behaviours, and that is our audiences. So we can have communications campaigns that reach out to our audiences in terms of what we'd like them to do, how we'd like to give them information so that they can understand what their role is in environmental action and climate action as part of your policy. So thinking from that internal and then outwards when we're mapping out our influence. There is we will be sharing the slides with you, and you can download this one and print it out on an A0 page and put it all out on the table with you and your core team, and really start understanding and identifying who these different engagement stakeholders that you need to engage are, whether they're in that knowledge sharing space. So that might be the indirect influence on our audiences, for example, when we're communicating to them how we'd like them to travel to the festival, or why we've made different choices about catering this year. There's policy influences. That might be your core team, the direct influence that you have in terms of working together. Or in fact, policy influencers might be indirect influence. Your local county councils is a really good example of this. So a nice little, I suppose, a framework for when we're starting to develop the policy and the plan and looking at how we might engage it. Might be something that you just stick up on the wall and get out with our post-it notes and really kind of get into the details so that we can understand and map out who we want to engage and who those important stakeholders are. You could have a different color post-it note for different members of your team or different departments so that you can really get into the nitty-gritty of who, where, and what you have that influence and that decision-making piece around the development of your policy and plan. So yeah, I just wanted to invite you to think a little bit more on this, on who you work with and for. And again, like I've worked in festivals for many, many years, and I'm still at it from time to time. And what I've always said is that festivals are an exercise in multi-stakeholder engagement. Festival organizers and production companies wear many different hats on a given day and have such a wide sphere of influence and network of stakeholders that we engage with in many different ways and using many different communication channels. So just to start to have a think of who you work with and for, and the same goes for production companies. And there's a little bit more in terms of the technical, the set, the costumes, and the lighting design for production companies potentially than there would be potentially for festivals, although festivals obviously have their own staging and lighting and so on. But just to start thinking about that stakeholder network and how you might engage with those. And I do have yet another poll to see if everybody's on their toes. I was wondering if we could start thinking about who the most important stakeholder might be when you are developing your climate action and environmental policy and implementation plan. So of everybody that you engage with, who are the most important to the ambitions of that climate and environmental action policy? Is it your audiences? Will they help you achieve what you want to do? Is it the staff, the team, the volunteers? Potentially it's your sponsors. Potentially it's performers or artists. So I'll just give you a minute maybe to have a good think about that. We see that
and maybe just say you can scroll down sometimes with those, because you don't realize there's quite a few options there. You might only see some on your screen, but scroll down, there's quite a few options.
Indeed there is. Thank you, Katrina. Yeah. So it could be performers or artists. It could be suppliers or service providers. Funders and sponsors might be important, but the most important, do you think, in terms of reaching the goals, when you start to think about the aspirations of what you'd like to do with your environmental policy, who are those folks? So everybody has answered, and the staff, team, volunteers, that core team, your direct team sphere of influence seems to be the most important. We did have a second one then, Brecken, if you wouldn't mind launching that. So the second question is, of those stakeholders, who do you have the most influence over? So this is a slightly different question. So again, we've got the same kind of list of stakeholders to choose from your audiences to your community, to your local authority, your performers, your artists, suppliers and service providers. There's a good mix. But again, it's about starting to think of who do I need to engage with? Who is going to be most important to help me? And how much influence or how can I work with those? And it seems that staff, team, and volunteers are the clear winners yet again. So everybody who is on our webinar this morning, I think, has a really good understanding of how they're going to get started. Katrina, I might hand back over to you now for the next session. So.
No.
Thanks for engaging in all our questions, folks. Good to see you all here.
No, so great. Thanks, Megan. So Megan has really covered. I mean, it is interesting to get your feedback on in terms of who you can influence and who you think is most important. And we've looked there, obviously, at the benefits of engaging with your stakeholders, and also how you might map those stakeholders, which is really important. So once you've done that, once you've kind of identified who the stakeholders are, who the most important ones are, the next step really is to find a way of getting those people on board. This is, I suppose, a slightly personal view, but I think it's really, really important to get people involved in an early stage. And that might be in quite an informal setting. So it's not necessarily that you're going to get them straight into the nitty gritty of what your environmental policy or climate action environmental policy is going to be about, because that in itself can be quite daunting and a bit off-putting. But if you can bring people together in a sort of slightly more sociable way, in a more informal setting, and it's again that the importance of involving as many people as you can, so that, for example, it's critical to have people involved in your bar if you've got a bar staff, or people involved in catering, people involved in waste. So if you've got a waste contractor that you use regularly, if you're a festival and so on. So it's really bringing all those people together. And rather than, obviously you're going to express your commitment to having an environmental, climate action and environmental policy, but you're also gives you an opportunity to find out from them how they feel about the whole prospect of creating that policy. How do they feel about climate change? How do they feel about the biodiversity crisis? So you're drawing them in on a very broad basis, but you're drawing some of their wisdom, because you could have a box office manager that is an excellent box office manager, but actually, unbeknownst to you, is also a member of local climate action network and has done a lot of really good work in that field. So it's not just the particular expertise that people you work with have, it's all of that other knowledge that they might have outside of a work setting that you may not be familiar with. They might have changed how they eat, they might have changed how they travel, but actually that's all part of their private life and you don't know it. So bringing people in at that early stage and asking them how they feel about climate change, what they have done in their private lives, all of that can create a kind of sense of connection with other people, a sense that you're interested in their views and so on. So I would highly recommend that. And so that's one of the things you can do. You can organize a get together and maybe consider inviting a guest speaker, because that's a little bit of a hook to draw people in. Particularly if that, obviously, I think you're sometimes, when we're working with a group of people that are rather used to listening to us, and maybe less inclined to be motivated by us, particularly if you're in a senior role in an organization, what's really good is to bring in somebody. It could be a local person who's very active in climate action. It could be a member of your local authority. All local authorities now have climate action officers. It could be somebody who's involved in biodiversity. So somebody that would be interesting to them and kind of inspire and motivate them. It's nice to maybe have a bit of food to go along with that. And again, if you can source food that is locally sourced, that's seasonal, that's produced locally, all of that, and if some of it at least is plant-based, all of that will help to kind of gel people together and to focus the theme on everything to do with climate change and biodiversity loss. So find out what they've done, and have they got any plans? Do they have any thoughts in terms of what you could do? You could also organize a trip to maybe a local nature or eco art project. There are so many creative climate action projects happening all around the country. I think there are 43 different projects. It might be interesting to go and visit one of those, or even hear from the artist who's involved in that. You could run a competition or a quiz or a survey. It's a kind of very light touch. You could also do a workshop day, so something a little bit more like work, where you're bringing somebody in, for somebody who's very experienced, who can really engage with your team and get you sort of on the road to creating that policy. You can set up a working group, a focus group, or a green team, all kinds of different names for those groupings. But just a word of caution that green teams, the difficulty sometimes is if in an organization you have a green team, it's almost as if the responsibility for that work lies with the few people in that team, and that it's not really directly connected to everybody else. So it tends to offload the responsibility and silo the whole sustainability climate action approach in one group of people. So just to be careful of that. And be sure to include the relevant members of your team when making specific decisions about actions you want to take. And we've got a bit of a cautionary tale about that later on. So, you're going to need somebody who's involved in backstage. You're going to need somebody or who's involved in the sort of whole technical side of things. You're going to want to include somebody who's involved in waste and waste collection. Obviously, when it comes to a production, you're looking at people from the design end of things, because that happens so early on. Your lighting designers, your set designers, they're all involved at an early stage, but they may need to be involved a little bit earlier again if you really want to draw them in. if you organize a get together, you're obviously going to have to pay people who are freelance staff. So just bear that in mind. And maybe that's something that you could add in as an additional request for funding, either from the Arts Council or your local authority, just because it's not totally free. People's time has to be acknowledged, and if they're not in a full-time wage with you, you need to be able to pay them in some way. You can also ask people what they do in their own individual roles, because people in marketing may not always think of what their role might be in climate action, outside of perhaps reducing the amount of posters and flyers, but their role could be very much about communicating to an audience. If you've got a festival where you have large groups of people traveling to an event, well, then the marketing can really focus on, connecting with those people to encourage them to travel in a more sustainable way. Finance, which is an area that maybe we don't think of straight away when it comes to the member of your team that might be very active on climate. But, the finance person is the person that maybe is looking after travel expenses. So they're in an ideal position to keep a track of that. And maybe one or two more columns in a spreadsheet might give you that extra information about distances traveled and mode of travel. They're the first people to open a bill for whether it's heating or electricity or gas or whatever you're using, and again, can put that easily into a spreadsheet. And they're also the person that might be involved in looking at a budget for your whatever you want to do, whatever you're going to try and implement in terms of climate action. So all of those people within your organization need to reflect on their own roles and how they can play a part in climate action. So just a few cautionary tales, and this is just with thanks to artist Lisa Fingleton. Some of you who know me might know that I used to run a theatre and arts centre in Tralee, and I suppose at the time I had all kinds of wonderful ideas about, because I had a big sort of background in my private life in terms of sort of green stuff. So I tried then to implement that in the organisation. And I suppose I was lucky in the sense that because I was the CEO at the time, I had a degree of power, and, maybe the power went to my head a little bit. And it is an example of how you can think, you have all the great ideas and the solutions to everything. And really all you need to do is share those solutions and those ideas with everybody else, and everybody will just say, oh, my goodness, how wonderful you are, and how delighted we are to have you to share all this wisdom with us. But of course, that's not necessarily how people react. And in fact, people react poorly to being told what to do. And what I didn't do was what I'm really advocating to all of you is that you involve people from the very beginning, so they have that sense of, I have contributed. My role and my input matters in this whole process. It's not just a tick box exercise. And, I'm not just going to be given a sort of checklist of stuff that I have to do. I'll be involved in deciding that. And yes, you don't have to be a hero or a know-it-all. In fact, it really doesn't help. What you need to be is facilitating wider engagement of other people rather than, climate leaders. I sometimes can be a little bit skeptical of that. We want everybody to be involved. We don't just want to be always leading the way. And maybe a practical example of what can go wrong. And this was an example of a theatre, a very well-run and respected theatre, over 300 seats, and it was not a Shimps Theatre, as it turns out. And they really wanted to address the whole issue of disposable cups, because there was an enormous amount of plastic cups being thrown out every single night after an event. So they were a very heavily programmed theatre. So they decided that they would replace their disposable plastic cups with reusable plastic cups that could be washed and reused every day, and then really eliminate the amount of waste that was being thrown out. So the CEO, director, and the operations person got together, and they thought a lot and did a lot of research into what good options would be for those reusable cups, and order them, and the cups arrived and so on. And some weeks later, the director went into the theatre one night and into the bar, and lo and behold, the remnants of the old disposable cups were still being used, and the wonderful reusable plastic cups were still packed away in their boxes. So, and when he tackled the staff and said, "What's the story? Why are you using the old disposable cups? We've got these wonderful reusable cups that you can use." They said, "Well, we don't have time to wash them." So it's a classic example of nobody had thought, if you've got suddenly, instead of throwing out 250 or 300 plastic cups, you suddenly have 200 or 300 cups that need to be washed and dried and stacked. That is a significant amount of time. Nobody had allocated that extra time or factored in the extra money that was really needed to pay staff to do that extra work. So it's just an example of how, I'm going to stop sharing my screen now because I think we have another Zoom poll for you, but it's just an example of how if you don't consult people, if you ignore the people who are actually delivering, for example, so if you make a new policy around waste, but you don't involve the people who are responsible for cleaning the building, well, then you are definitely going to find that, sorry, that's my phone telling me to shut up. I'm not going to listen. So, yeah, apologies. So collaboration, consultation really is the name of the game. And I think Brecon has another poll for you there. Just, wondering, have you engaged to date? Have you engaged with different members of your staff team, and who would they be? Some of you may have engaged with all of them. It doesn't matter if it's informal, it can be an informal, it doesn't have to be something very structured, but just that sense of collaborating. Yeah, that's great. And again, don't forget to scroll down that. There's a couple of options right down as far as funders and audiences. So I think, Megan, over to you.
Brilliant. Thanks a million, Katrina, and thanks for those cautionary tales as well. It's great to have the case studies, both of successes, but also of challenges and learnings that we've had. Okay, so I'm going to run through a couple of examples from the field. Thanks to everybody for filling in the polls. I think pretty much everybody has filled it in, and the vast majority are at least starting to engage with colleagues and collaborators. So that's fantastic. And in some cases, some board members and suppliers as well. So fair play to you, and hopefully following this webinar, we can start engaging with some more of our stakeholders. So yeah, I've got a couple of examples here. The first one is about actually a TV series that was produced here in Ireland back in 2018, I believe, or 2019. This was the Young Offenders Series 2 and 3. And there were two producers who were working on this, Sharon Cronin and Sasha Dillon. And funnily enough, Sharon Cronin was the volunteers manager in Body and Soul Festival many, many years ago. So that's how I knew her. But yeah, these guys put together a really nice and very visible way of approaching bringing environmental action and engaging with the wider production team on this production. So what they did was they created an Eco Week board. And what's nice about this is that it's really visible. So they created this board from salvage materials, and they made it so that it could go up in the production office, but it could also be taken down and moved around to the different locations so that it became something that was really an active part of the production itself. And what they were doing was they were basically doing a little bit of a carrot and a stick. So they were engaging all of the different departments and getting them to start thinking about how they could do their day-to-day activities in a different way and start to think about how they could reduce their impacts on the environment during this production. So each department had a number of different actions that would get them points in terms of positive actions, really simple things like using a keep cup or recycling and composting and separating their waste properly, or reducing their waste streams by reusing things. Then there was more points for things like carpooling or walking or cycling to the locations or to the production office. And then there was a big set of points, like a 10-pointer, were for department-wide initiatives. So from the individual to the department. So using secondhand materials as costumes and props, using LED lights, rechargeable batteries, and just really starting to think about how they as individuals and a department could make change and run their own departments as part of the wider production in a different way. But they were also looking at negative actions, and they were minusing 2 points against it with this as well. So not using the bins properly, not going with keep cups on a coffee run, littering on location, cigarette butts, real issue around them, bringing cars to set unnecessarily, whatever it might be. So they were just thinking about rewarding positive actions and minusing those points for those negative actions. And so this was a really visible piece inside in this production. And what they did was they tracked all of those actions throughout the week and added it up at the end, making it really clear and really visible so everybody knew and was accountable and was engaged in this. And the results of it were fantastic because they were incentivized. There was little bits and pieces that people could win. At the end of the day, there was 2 spot prizes. One was at lunchtime for an individual, and the second was on the wrap of the day for the department of the day. So this was given to the department who had won the most points that day, but hadn't lost the most amount of points, or it was given to the department that was leading the competition. So like a league table, essentially. But what's important about this is because the reason I bring up this one is because that's a really visual piece. Because often when we create a policy, we sit down with our team and hopefully following today's webinar, we'll engage with our stakeholders, we'll write it all out, but then it exists as a document somewhere. And it's something that can live on a shelf and kind of get a little bit forgotten because it's not as tangible. So having it in that very visual and visible way so that it becomes ingrained in the psyche with the team is a really nice example. And not only that, but when the teams are engaged and the departments are engaged, and we're starting to see really nice kind of results and people being really happy that they've won, that they've been really on board with this and engaged with it. And then that kind of creates that positive narrative about it and everybody can get into it and engage with it. So that was a really nice example, I thought. I also wanted to bring in an example of a festival that we worked with very recently, the weekend just gone. We were working with the production on the Earth Rising Festival in the Irish Museum of Modern Art. And I wanted to bring this in because this is an example of us teaming up with an existing program and production team in the venue. So two different teams coming together, and how we wanted to work with them to reduce the impacts of the festival. Now, obviously, the festival itself is already very engaged in this space, and it is a climate action festival. But just in terms of the way that we approached bridging that gap between our team and theirs. So the first thing that we did was we outlined the pieces that we were bringing to help contribute to the actions of the festival. So we were looking at bringing in an eco fair, which was what the festival called it. This is a market, or conscious craft market, where all of the traders had circular economy and environmental principles and needed to display those as criteria to trade. So talking through that application process and ensuring that everybody understood what it was that we were trying to achieve there. We also implemented a circular food court. So this was 4 or 5 different trading units. And again, the design of the approach to bringing those trading units and those caterers on board, and the depth and the detail in terms of how they procure their ingredients, or how they work with their suppliers, or how they create the menus that they did for the festival, was of real key importance. And we wanted to make sure that not only those of us who were directly across the circular food court, but also the rest of the program and the communications team understood that, so that when they were having the conversations with their stakeholders, their networks, and their wider audiences and teams, that they understood how that curation of the catering had actually happened. We also put in a welcome tent for this one. So again, this was a information hub at the festival where people could find out about the program, the different workshops and talks that were running throughout the weekend, but also where we could capture audience members and staff members and ask them about how they traveled to the festival, what they were intending on taking part in, and really understanding the engagement with stakeholders in that wider sense. And the reason being was because we were undertaking a carbon footprint analysis of that event. So what we did was we commenced with the design and all of these concepts and ideas. And then we sat down and we spent 1 hour with the program and production team at IMA to talk them through all of these things in detail and provide them with a bit of a visual, but also a space to ask questions and to see how we might work together on it. We gave them a really good visual of what the trading application looked like, how they could share it amongst their networks, and they could potentially bring other folks that we might not even know to take part in it as well. So as Katrina was just saying, it's not just about the core team and what we know, but we don't know who else knows other people in this network. This is a collective movement that is definitely growing. There is more and more happening in this space all the time. So the more we have those conversations, the more we can bring people together on it. We talked through in step-by-step the carbon footprinting approach. And this was really key to have this conversation with the wider team quite early, because in order for us to undertake a carbon footprint assessment and analysis, we needed buy-in from the team for that data gathering piece. As some of you are probably very, very aware, that data gathering piece of the wider stakeholder network, it can be really tricky for a festival, A, because there are so many, and B, because just getting those communications through to all of these stakeholders and asking them what's quite often a new ask in terms of supplying data back to the festival so that you can better understand your environmental impacts is something that we do need support in. It can't be left to just one member of the team or the green team. It needs to be going outward throughout that stakeholder spheres of influence so that everybody can get on board. So it was really important for us to talk through this really clearly and allow loads of space for questions and queries and understanding from our team and from the program team and vice versa. So we could understand who communicates with who when, so that we could try and implement this initiative. I also wanted to look at circularity at the Body and Soul Festival. I was involved in Body and Soul Festival for, I want to say about 15 years. But in 2019, we signed up to the Green Deal for Circular Festivals, which is an initiative of the, it was actually an initiative of the Dutch Ministry for the Environment. And it was 17 different festivals from across Europe who signed up together to pledge to become fully circular by 2025 in all of their operations. Massively, massively ambitious. As you can see, yeah, that's me up there on the stage. Now, I'm used to being a festival organizer, so in the background, so a very uncomfortable moment for me, up there with the Dutch Minister for the Environment when we launched this. So we launched it and we brought it to Body and Soul and started to try and do these circular initiatives. But we quickly realized, and particularly when we reopened after the COVID pandemic, that we needed to engage with the team in a much more integrated sense, because there were, again, what were some of the barriers that we were experiencing? And I've got a little anecdote about making the switch from single-use plastics as well. But what were the barriers that we were kind of perceiving were that the team weren't aware at an early enough stage of what their roles in these initiatives towards circularity might be. So in 2022, we devised a dedicated workshop to this, to the Green Deal for Circular Festivals and to what we wanted to implement with the team. We looked at all of the different themes that are covered by the Green Deal for Circular Festivals and like really opened the workshop with starting to dig a little bit deeper into what those different environmental impacts are of the festival. So a little bit of myth busting for the wider team, but also kind of breaking it out so that the team could understand that that the team themselves are decision makers in all of those impact areas. So who is across the sourcing for food and drink? If you think about it, Artist Liaison is part of that conversation as well, because they're ordering food for artists and performers, as well as our catering manager and our hospitality manager. If we think about it, our stage design and technical and our bar managers all have input into energy at our festival. Some of you might be from outdoor or greenfield sites, and it's crazy to me how early bar managers want to switch on the cold rooms at a festival like that, because they believe that the beer won't be cold enough by the time that the festival goes live if they haven't got it switched on 2 days beforehand. I've had many a discussion with bar managers about that one. Also, just looking at resource efficiency, moving away from that term of waste management into resources, and just thinking in different ways of all of these different impacts and how I, as a festival person or working in a production company, have influence and impact in these spaces, and what are the decisions that I could start making differently potentially. Just to give you a little bit of a tidbit, one of the areas that we looked at was energy and power, literally just a really, really, really coherent turning off the light switch off system, or light switch off policy, and just starting to really understand what our energy consumption is and when are we using it and if we really need it. Another one we looked at was resource efficiency. And again, it was that little bit of myth busting without going too much into the science. As Katrina rightly mentioned, sometimes it just causes people to glaze over, and that's okay. But just to touch on it so that we can have those conversations and set the context and the team and the scene a little bit, and just have those little kind of snappy, eye-opening kind of stats so that the team can understand what it is that we're trying to achieve. And then just to have fun with it, really. You know, in terms of engaging with the team, and particularly in the creative sector and in festival production and in production companies, we are creative industry professionals. We love to express ourselves in loads of different ways, and having a little bit of a fun with this. I mean, developing a policy and an environmental policy and climate action policy and implementation plan, it can feel quite heavy-handed, and it can feel like it's quite a lot. And there's lots of legislation to think of, and there's an environmental crisis, and all of these different lexicons that are used around this space. But we're used to having fun with the work that we do. So why don't we just try and engage our stakeholders through that lens? Because the opportunities for doing things differently are phenomenal, and particularly for those of us in the creative sector. So as I was saying, having a look at those different impact areas where we feel we might be able to have an impact, maybe not covering them all in 1 year, probably too much, it's probably going to be really overwhelming, but just understanding where our key decisions are in those areas. And then having a look at our festival team, all of the different, and our production company teams, all of the different people who are working together and overlapping and are part of that wider system, I guess, in a way. And then what we did was, during our workshop on this, was we invited everybody to go away for 10 minutes and literally start to bullet point out what are the key decisions in terms of step by step, where they could start looking at doing things a little bit differently. Then they fed back to the wider team and asked who could collaborate with them in helping them make those decisions. So really an individual effort into a team effort in working through those sustainable principles and practices at the festival. And then just to finish, what we really wanted to drive home was the influence piece with Body and Soul. So the festival in and of itself, and all of your festivals and productions, are an opportunity to tell a story with this. So having those values and ensuring that our core team have those underlying values, which no doubt they do, and that respect, and then using that platform to tell that story to our wider stakeholders, to our wider network, to our audiences. Influencing each other. So having those conversations over and over again and developing them out every time. And then other festivals, other productions, hopefully we can start to develop a network on the back of this training program where people can do some peer-to-peer learning and sharing. And then looking at that opportunity for real societal impact. After the workshop, we all went for a pint together. And I just wanted to also drop that in, because it gets to that place where we have a workshop, we're in that work setting, it's formal, we're developing a policy, we're looking at the initiatives that we're going to do. And then we move that to an informal setting where we can have those relaxed conversations and get into the nitty-gritty and really identify the passion. And I believe that it was that piece, that going from the formal to the informal, that lined us up for the successes that we had with the circular initiatives in Body and Soul in 2022. So to wrap up then, engagement do's and engagement don'ts for bringing the stakeholders along on this journey in developing the policy and action plan. So understanding and mapping those key people that you need to engage with. That's really, really key, from your core team to your suppliers, your network, your artists and performers, and your wider audience. Being open and transparent, really important here as well. There is that little bit of a fear of greenwashing, of using the wrong terminology, of holding ourselves accountable once we get started. But if we're transparent and honest, that's the best that any of us can do in this space. Actively listening to people, so not just coming down from top down. I think we've probably driven that home today. But actively listening to the team and the stakeholders in terms of what's actionable as part of this policy and plan. Documenting and sharing the policy, encouraging co-creation, collaboration, building trust, and inviting the team to come together to update that policy every few years as the landscape changes and as everything has changed and as everybody is starting to gather learning. Engagement don'ts then is don't exclude the key people. If you've identified them in that mapping process, then bring them in as part of your policy. Don't ignore critical feedback, really important. Bring it on board. Don't take it too personally. Learn from it and use it to develop and enhance the policy. And of course, don't forget to put a follow-up process in place after 6 months or a year so that you can see where the successes are, where their learnings are, and how you can make your policy and action plan better for you and for all of your stakeholder network. So I really hope that was helpful. What we're going to be doing next is moving on to next week, which is the developing of the action plan itself. So we've gotten started, we've understood our roles in this, we're getting people on board and engaging with our stakeholders. So the next step is next week is to look at sitting down and developing an action plan with our team. On the 22nd of October, then we're going to be looking at travel and transport. And on the 15th of October, so those are actually back to front, my apologies, we'll be looking at audience travel, which again is a key one for festivals in Ireland particularly. We'll be looking at materials and procurement, at content programming and communications. We're going to look in detail at energy for festivals in November. And then on the 12th of November, we're going to be looking at climate adaptation. So a huge thank you to you all for joining us today. I hope that's been useful, and a huge thank you for all of your engagement.